A hidden note in the napkin made the billionaire at table 9 stand up before the waiter arrived. Comment where you are watching from and subscribe to the channel. Let's get to the story. The Italian bistro occupied the ground floor of an elegant Art Deco building on Main Street, its large windows offering a prime view of the nighttime hustle and bustle of New York City. The tables covered with white linen contrasted with the exposed brick walls, where black and white photographs of old Italian families gazed nostalgically at the diners. The aroma of fresh basil and sautéed garlic lingered in the air, mixed with the soft sound of conversations in various languages and the gentle clinking of crystal glasses. Helen Foster, at 42, sat rigidly at table 17, her delicate hands trembling imperceptibly as she watched her fiancé Ryan move toward the restaurant lobby, the phone already glued to his ear. She was a woman of understated yet striking beauty, light brown hair pulled back in a low bun that revealed the natural elegance of her neck, green eyes that carried a sharp intelligence masked by deep melancholy, and a posture that oscillated between the sophistication of someone who had spent years teaching art history at NYU and the tension of someone who had learned to measure every movement to avoid conflict. "I need to talk to Mark now. It's about the contractor's contract," Ryan murmured as he walked away, but Helen noticed the harsh tone he only used when he was annoyed with her. Her hands, covered in cold sweat, reached for the linen napkin resting next to the plate of mushroom risotto she had barely touched. During the 15 minutes she had been alone, her mind wandered through the memories of the last 2 years, the sudden death of Aunt Carol, the unexpected inheritance of nearly $2 million, and how Ryan had gradually taken control of every aspect of her financial and emotional life. At table 9, just 3 meters away, Edward Smith discreetly observed the unfolding scene. At 48, he possessed the magnetic presence typical of men accustomed to command. Broad shoulders perfectly filling his navy blue Italian suit, impeccably styled grey hair, and dark eyes that missed no detail of the environment around him. Owner of the Smith Heritage Hotels chain, specializing in boutique hotels in historic American cities, Edward had developed over the years an almost supernatural intuition for identifying people in vulnerable situations, perhaps because his own mother had gone through similar experiences decades earlier. He first noticed the tremor in Helen's hands, then the way she constantly looked toward the lobby, as if calculating the distance to the exit. When she began to write something on the napkin, Edward leaned slightly, pretending to adjust the napkin in his own lap. The shaky letters formed a word that made him choke on his wine. "Help!" Helen lifted her eyes at that exact moment, and the desperate look they exchanged lasted only 3 seconds. But it was enough for Edward to understand the gravity of the situation. She quickly folded the napkin and hid it under the plate, her eyes filling with contained tears as she saw Ryan returning, his face marked by barely concealed irritation. "Sorry, love. Problems at the office," Ryan said, his voice carrying a tone of false concern that he couldn't completely mask the coldness. "You haven't even touched your food. Are you feeling okay?" "I'm a bit nauseous," Helen murmured, avoiding his gaze. "Maybe it's better if we go home." Of course. You know I always worry about your health. Ever since you stopped working, you've been a bit unstable, haven't you?" Edward observed how Ryan placed his hand on Helen's shoulder, a gesture that to outside observers would seem affectionate, but clearly made her shrink slightly. The businessman was well acquainted with this type of subtle manipulation, the false concern that actually served as a constant reminder of dependence and fragility. When the couple stood up to leave, Edward made a point of passing close to their table, pretending to search for something in his suit pocket. The moment he crossed paths with Helen, he whispered softly, without moving his lips, "The public library closes at 9 p.m. Helen shuddered, but did not show that she had heard. However, when she passed the mirror near the restaurant entrance, Edward saw that she had perfectly understood the message. Her green eyes reflected a mix of hope and terror that would accompany him throughout the sleepless night ahead. As he watched the couple disappear into the bustling night of New York City, Edward already knew that his life had just taken a completely unexpected turn. The woman of the napkin had awakened in him not only a protective instinct, but a determination he hadn't felt in years. Whatever future awaited them, he was determined to uncover the whole truth behind that silent plea for help. The New York Public Library stood majestically at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street, its neoclassical facade contrasting with the modern buildings surrounding it in downtown New York City. Helen climbed the marble steps with hesitant steps, carrying a brown leather folder that had belonged to her Aunt Carol. It was exactly 8:15 on a rainy Tuesday morning, and she had told Ryan she was going to the supermarket and then visiting an old college friend. "I need material on traditional American cuisine," she said to the librarian, a middle-aged man with thick-rimmed glasses who observed her with curiosity. "I'm researching for a personal project." The lie came out more easily than she expected. During her 2 years of relationship with Ryan, Helen had learned to construct palatable versions of the truth, small omissions that avoided endless interrogations about every minute of her day. The librarian directed her to the culinary section on the second floor, where tall, dark wooden shelves housed hundreds of volumes on the food history of Brazil. Helen chose a table near the stained glass windows that filtered the grey morning light into shades of blue and gold, creating an almost sacred atmosphere. She opened a book on colonial recipes from Virginia, but her hands trembled so much that she could barely turn the pages. The reality of being there, following the instructions of a complete stranger, terrified her as much as it excited her. It was the first truly autonomous decision she had made in months. At 9:20, Edward appeared in the architecture section, located just a few tables away. He wore a grey cashmere sweater and dark dress pants, carrying a black leather briefcase that he silently placed on the table. For 20 minutes, they both pretended to be absorbed in their respective readings, but Helen felt the weight of his gaze on her every time she turned a page. "Excuse me?" Edward finally said, approaching with a magazine on architectural restoration in hand. "I couldn't help but notice that you are researching Virginia traditions. Do you happen to know anything about colonial sacred art?" His voice was low, deliberately casual, but Helen sensed the controlled tension in his gestures. "I was an art history professor," she replied, almost whispering. "Sacred art is my specialty." What an extraordinary coincidence. Edward sat down in the chair next to her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I have a hotel in Colonial Heights, the Heritage House of Tales, and I am restoring an 18th century chapel. I need someone with specific knowledge about Baroque iconography." Helen felt her heart race. The proposal sounded like a lifeline, but also like a trap. I don't know if it would be possible. My fiancé prefers that I don't stray too far from home." "I completely understand," Edward said, his dark eyes studying every nuance of her expression. "Family matters are always delicate, but perhaps we could discuss this more calmly. Do you come here often?" "I plan to come every morning for a few weeks. For my book research." "What book?" Helen hesitated. The lie about traditional recipes seemed ridiculous in front of this clearly intelligent man. "A project about the influence of cuisine on cultural preservation." Edward nodded gravely, as if that made perfect sense. "Fascinating. Food as an element of cultural resistance. I imagine you will find a lot of interesting things about the Virginia trailblazers." Over the next 2 weeks, a silent routine established itself between them. Helen always arrived between 8:15 and 8:30, settling at the same table near the stained glass. Edward invariably appeared at 9:20, carrying different magazines on architecture and restoration. They exchanged few words, but each brief conversation revealed layers of mutual knowledge that surprised them both. "Have you seen the frescoes of St. Francis of Assisi Church in Colonial Heights?" Edward asked on a rainy Thursday, watching Helen flip through a book about a Tadi. "Several times. I wrote my master's thesis on the European iconographic influences in Atadi's work," she replied, and for the first time in months her eyes sparkled with genuine enthusiasm. The way he adapted Italian perspective techniques to the colonial context is absolutely fascinating. Could you explain that to me in more detail someday? Helen looked around the library as if someone might be watching. I would love to, but your fiancé wouldn't approve, Edward completed gently. He worries about me. He thinks I'm not ready to return to work after some personal issues. Edward noticed how she unconsciously touched her left wrist while speaking, a gesture he had observed several times before. What kind of issues, if you don't mind me asking? I lost my aunt 2 years ago. She raised me after my parents died. It was difficult. I'm sorry. Family losses can be devastating, Helen nodded, but Edward sensed there was much more to the story. The way she avoided specific details, how her hands trembled when she mentioned her fiancé, how she constantly checked her phone for the time. Everything indicated that the situation was much more complex than simple mourning. You know, he said casually, flipping through a magazine about historic hotels, if you ever want to see the chapel I'm restoring, I would be happy to show you the work. It's a little gem from the colonial period, with frescoes that were probably painted by Attardi's disciples. Helen's eyes lit up again, but quickly clouded with concern. That would be wonderful, but Colonial Heights is far. That's true. About 2 hours by car from New York City. But it could just be a day trip, a quick consulting job. Consulting? Of course. I would pay for your expertise. $1,000 a day, plus expenses. It's the market rate for specialists in colonial sacred art, Helen gasped. $1,000 a day represented more money than she had seen in months, since Ryan had taken full control of her finances after her aunt's inheritance. I need to think, naturally. There's no rush. But they both knew there was a silent urgency hanging over those morning meetings in the library. With each passing day, Helen felt a little stronger. A little more capable of imagining a life beyond the suffocating walls of her apartment with Ryan, and Edward realized he was becoming emotionally involved in a situation that promised to be much more complicated than he had imagined. On that first night at the Italian bistro, the March sun painted the mountains surrounding Colonial Heights in gold as Edward's silver BMW X5 climbed the last curve of the road leading to the historic center. Helen pressed her hands against the beige leather seat, her amazed eyes scanning the streets lined with colonial mansions that piled up like an old watercolor against the blue Virginia sky. It was the first time in 2 years that she had left New York City, and the feeling of freedom was as intense as it was terrifying. It's even more beautiful than I remembered, she murmured, observing the towers of the Baroque churches that dotted the urban landscape like sentinels of sandstone. Have you been here before? Ryan asked, skillfully maneuvering through the narrow cobblestone streets. Several times during college? My colonial art professor, Dr. Beatrice Anderson, brought us here at least twice a semester. She said you can't understand the Baroque style just through books. Ryan smiled, noticing how Helena's voice gained strength and enthusiasm whenever she spoke about art. It was a remarkable transformation. The shy and withdrawn woman from the library became eloquent and passionate when discussing her area of expertise. The Heritage House of Tales occupied a colonial townhouse painted in ochre yellow on St. Joseph Street, its windows with dark green wooden shutters framing wrought iron balconies. Ryan parked in front of the hotel and led Helena through the lobby, where authentic colonial furniture harmoniously coexisted with discreet contemporary touches. The chapel is at the back of the property, he explained, guiding her down a corridor decorated with 18th century Portuguese tiles. It was originally part of a Franciscan convent. When I bought the property 5 years ago, I found documents suggesting it was painted between 1780 and 1790. They crossed an inner courtyard where century-old oak trees shaded a herb garden. Helena inhaled deeply the aroma of rosemary and basil, feeling enveloped by the serene atmosphere of the place. For a moment, she managed to completely forget the terrible argument she had with Ryan the night before. "You're crazy if you think I'm going to let you travel alone with a man you barely know," he had shouted, throwing her phone onto the kitchen table with enough force to crack the screen. "This isn't work, Helena. It's a childish fantasy of a woman who refuses to accept reality. It's just a one-day consultancy," she had replied, her voice trembling but determined. "I need to get back to work, Ryan. I can't stay home forever." "Get back to work?" Ryan had laughed bitterly. "With your aunt's money, you never have to work again. Unless you're planning to waste it all on artistic whims." The memory of that conversation made her shudder, even under the hot Virginia sun. Ryan noticed the change in her expression and stopped walking. "Are you okay? You look worried." "I'm fine," Helena lied, forcing a smile. It's exciting to be here again." St. Francis Chapel revealed itself as an architectural gem. Small, but perfectly proportioned, with walls covered in frescoes that time had faded but not completely destroyed. Helena stood frozen at the entrance, gazing at the paintings that adorned the vaulted ceiling. "My God," she whispered, her hands trembling with emotion. "This is extraordinary. Look at the shading technique in the cherubs, and how the artist adapted classical motifs to colonial tastes." Ryan watched her walk slowly through the interior of the chapel, her eyes scanning every detail of the paintings with the reverence of a pilgrim. It was evident that Helena was in her element, and the transformation was so complete that he wondered how anyone could want to keep a woman like her confined at home. "This angel here," Helena said, pointing to a winged figure in the upper right corner, "was clearly inspired by the iconographic manuals of Cesare Ripa, but look how the artist adapted the features to the local context. And this representation of the Virgin is almost certainly based on Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, but with influences from the Cusco school." Cusco school. Yes, from Cusco, Peru. It was common during the Brazilian colonial period to have artistic exchange between the different Spanish and Portuguese colonies. Artists traveled much more than we imagine. Ryan was fascinated not only by her knowledge, but by the evident passion she displayed. "How long would you need to do a complete analysis of the iconography?" Helena studied the walls carefully, doing mental calculations. "For a proper survey, maybe 6 weeks, coming once a week. It would be necessary to photograph each section, research the historical references, check period documents." 6 weeks of paid work, Ryan said thoughtfully. "That would represent $6,000. Helena felt her heart race. $6,000 would give her the financial independence she hadn't had in months. But it would also mean 6 discussions with Ryan, 6 mornings of tension, 6 nights of endless questioning. "I would really like to," she said slowly, "but I would need to talk to my fiancé. He worries when I'm away for too long. I understand." "But Helena—" Ryan stopped near a fresco depicting St. Francis receiving the stigmata. "Can I ask you a personal question?" She nodded, though her muscles tensed involuntarily. "Are you happy?" The question hit her like a punch in the stomach. No one had asked her that in so long that she had almost forgotten what it was like to think of happiness as a possible goal. I don't know what happiness is anymore," she replied honestly, her words softly echoing against the centuries-old walls of the chapel. Ryan nodded gravely. "Then maybe it's time to find out." As they drove back to New York City in the late afternoon, Helena gazed at the landscape through the glass, knowing that something fundamental had changed within her that day. The chapel had awakened not only her dormant professional passion, but also a hunger for life that she thought she had lost forever. And Ryan represented possibilities she dared not name, but that pulsed in her heart like the bells of the historic churches echoing through the Virginia afternoon. The discovery happened by chance on a sunny April afternoon, when Helena was exploring the upper rooms of the Heritage House of Tales in search of historical documents about the chapel. Ryan had given her full access to the hotel archive, a dusty room on the third floor where cardboard boxes held decades of correspondence, deeds, and old photographs. The smell of aged paper and old wood permeated the space, creating an atmosphere of mystery that made Helena feel like an archaeologist, unearthing lost secrets. "I found something interesting about the history of the property," she said, as Edward came upstairs to check on her progress, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee in the crisp mountain air. "What did you find?" he asked, placing the mugs on a mahogany table covered with documents organized in meticulous piles. "There's a correspondence from 1998 between the former owner and a certain Carol Foster." Helena held up a yellowed letter, her hands trembling slightly. "Carol was the name of my aunt." Edward froze for a moment, a strange expression crossing his face. "Carol Foster. That name sounds familiar." "Familiar how?" "My ex-wife's name was Julia Foster. She disappeared 5 years ago, shortly after our divorce." The silence that followed was thick as the fog that sometimes covered the mountains of Colonial Heights. Helena felt the world tilt slightly around her, as if the foundations of reality were shifting beneath her feet. "Julia was my cousin," she whispered, letting the letter fall onto the table. "A distant cousin, but we saw each other at family gatherings. She disappeared shortly after separating from her husband. We never knew what happened to her." Edward walked over to the window, overlooking the mountains, his hands clenched behind his back. "She left me a letter saying she needed to start a new life in another country. I never heard from her again." "What a strange coincidence," Helena murmured, but her mind was already working, connecting dots that formed a disturbing pattern. "Edward, don't you find it odd that we meet like this by chance, and then discover this connection?" He turned, studying her with those dark eyes that missed nothing. "Are you suggesting our meeting wasn't accidental?" "I'm just thinking out loud." Helena flipped through more correspondence, searching for clues. "My Aunt Carol was always very reserved about the family's finances. When she died, I found out she had much more money than we realized. And I also discovered she was in contact with people I didn't know." Edward approached the table, his features tense. "Helena, there's something I need to tell you about Julia. Our marriage ended because she discovered some irregularities in my partner's business, Mark Thompson. She had evidence that he was embezzling money from the hotels." The name hit Helena like a lightning bolt. "Mark Thompson? Isn't that the name of the partner at the law firm that represents my fiancé?" "What do you mean?" "No." "Ryan always talks about the lawyer Mark Thompson when discussing the investments of my inheritance. He says he's a specialist in wealth management." Edward sat heavily in an old chair, running his hands through his hair. "This can't be a coincidence." Helena began to pace the room, her mind organizing information with the analytical precision she applied to studying works of art. "Let's look at the facts. Julia was married to you and discovered irregularities involving Mark Thompson. She disappears. 2 years later, my aunt dies and leaves me a considerable inheritance. Ryan appears in my life shortly after and directs me to the same Mark Thompson to manage my money. And we just happened to meet at a restaurant." Edward darkly completed. "Was it really by chance?" Helena stopped in front of an old photograph of the city. "Edward, do you frequent that restaurant regularly?" "No, it was the first time I dined there. I was passing through the area after a meeting and decided to stop. And I was there because Ryan insisted we go. He said he wanted to celebrate the first anniversary of the day we met." They exchanged a long look, both understanding they were at the center of something much larger and more dangerous than they had imagined. "Helena," Edward said carefully, "I need to ask you a question. Does your fiancé have full access to your inheritance?" "Yes. He said it would be more practical for him to handle everything since I was very shaken by my aunt's death. I signed a power of attorney, giving him the authority to manage the accounts." "And have you been monitoring the statements?" Helena blushed. "Ryan always says I don't need to worry about that he takes care of everything so I can focus on recovering emotionally." Edward stood up and walked over to her, his hands gently resting on her shoulders. Helena, I need you to be very careful from now on. If my suspicion is correct, you could be in danger. What kind of danger? The same kind that made Julia disappear. At that moment, Helena's phone buzzed with a message from Ryan. Where are you? You should have been back by now. I'm worried. She showed the message to Edward, who frowned. Does he always monitor your schedule like this? Always. He says it's out of love. Edward watched her type a reassuring response and noticed how her hands trembled. Helena, do you trust me? I don't know who to trust anymore. Then trust your instincts. What are they telling you right now? Helena closed her eyes, taking a deep breath of the fragrant air filled with blooming flowers coming through the open window. They're telling me my whole life could be a lie constructed by other people, and what do you want to do about it? For the first time in months, Helena felt a spark of determination ignite in her chest. I want to uncover the truth, all of it. As they descended the creaking wooden stairs, both knew they had crossed an invisible line. From that moment on, they would no longer be just a recovering teacher and a helpful businessman. They were allies in a quest for the truth that could destroy everything Helena thought she knew about her life, but it could also be her only chance at freedom. The sun began to set behind the mountains as they headed back to New York City, but the darkness that awaited them was much denser than the approaching night. The month of May arrived in New York City, carrying a dry chill that made the mornings especially gray. Helena was in the kitchen preparing coffee when she discovered the first. It was a concrete indication that her life had become a technological prison. Her phone, which had been charging overnight, was acting strangely. Apps she didn't remember installing, a battery that drained quickly, and more disturbingly, a location history that showed all the places she had visited in the past weeks. Ryan, she called, trying to keep her voice casual while he read the newspaper at the dining table in their apartment in Brooklyn. My phone is having some issues. I think I need to take it to the repair shop. Ryan looked up from the economics section, his features taking on that false concern expression that Helen had learned to dread. What kind of issues, love? Strange apps, a battery that doesn't last, that sort of thing. Leave it to me. I have an excellent contact who takes care of the office's electronics. He can fix this without you having to leave the house. It was always like this. Ryan had a solution for everything, as long as that solution kept Helen within the control perimeter he had established around her. She nodded silently, but her mind was already formulating a plan. 2 hours later, at the New York Public Library, Helen presented her findings to Edward with the precision of someone delivering an academic paper. He installed a tracking app, she said, showing him the phone. He can see where I am at any moment, who I talk to, what websites I visit. Edward examined the device, his expression hardening with each second. Helen, this isn't protection. It's surveillance, I know. And there's more. She pulled out a folder with documents she had secretly copied. I managed to access my account statements. In 2 years, Ryan withdrew over $800,000. Always small amounts, always with plausible explanations. Investments, insurance, maintenance of properties he supposedly bought in my name. Properties that exist? I have no idea. He never showed me anything concrete. Edward studied the papers, his features growing darker. Helen, I need to tell you something about my own situation. Yesterday I received an official notification from the IRS. I'm being investigated for tax evasion and money laundering. Helen's blood ran cold. What does that mean? It means someone planted false evidence to incriminate me. And I'm almost sure who it was. Mark Thompson. Exactly. The same man who manages your money is the one trying to destroy me. Helen felt as if she were watching a macabre puzzle being assembled before her eyes. Edward, do you think Ryan knows I'm seeing you? I'm sure he does. The question is, what does he intend to do about it? The answer came that very afternoon, when Helen returned to the apartment and found Ryan talking on the phone with someone, his voice heavy with irritation that he rarely showed in her presence. No, it's not that simple, he was saying, pacing back and forth in the living room. She's not an idiot. If we push too hard, she might suspect. Helen froze in the hallway, hidden behind the wall that separated the entrance from the living room. Yes, I know that Edward Smith is being investigated. That makes things easier, but it also complicates them. If she discovers the connection... No, we can't just make her disappear like the cousin. That would be too suspicious. Helen's heart stopped. Ryan knew about Julia. He knew and was involved in whatever had happened to her. Listen, Mark, give me 2 more weeks. I'll convince her to transfer the rest of the money to the offshore accounts. After that, we can deal with the businessman once and for all. Helen silently backed away, her hands trembling so much that she could barely hold the apartment key. She managed to get to the bathroom without making a sound and locked the door, leaning against the sink as she tried to process what she had just heard. Ryan was not just a controlling boyfriend using her money. He was part of a larger scheme involving Mark Thompson, which had resulted in Julia's disappearance and now threatened both her and Edward. When she finally emerged from the bathroom, Ryan was in the kitchen, preparing dinner with a smile that she now recognized as completely fake. "How was your day, love?" he asked, kissing her forehead with a tenderness that made her feel nauseous. "Normal. I went to the library, did some research." "That's great. And how's your cookbook coming along?" The question sounded like a trap. "Slowly. It's more complex than I imagined. I'm sure you'll manage." "You're so talented." He stopped chopping vegetables and watched her with those eyes that she now perceived as cold as ice. "Helen, we need to talk about something important." "What?" "Mark found an extraordinary investment opportunity. International funds, guaranteed return of 20% per year. But we need to act quickly." "What kind of investment?" "Real estate in California. The American market is hot, and with the depreciation of the dollar, it's the perfect time to diversify." Helen forced a smile. "Sounds interesting. But can't we discuss this more calmly? Maybe I should meet Mark in person before making such an important decision." Ryan's expression subtly changed, like a cloud passing in front of the sun. "I don't think that's necessary. I trust him completely, and you trust me, right?" "Of course I trust you." But as she said this, Helen knew she had lied for the last time. From that moment on, every word they exchanged would be part of a deadly game where the rules were unclear, but the stakes were her freedom and, possibly, her life. That night, lying next to Ryan, who pretended to sleep, Helen planned her next move. She needed to warn Edward about the imminent danger. She needed to find concrete evidence of the scheme, and most importantly, she needed to do all of this without Ryan realizing that she had discovered the truth. The digital clock on the bedside table read 3:47 a.m. when she finally fell asleep, dreaming of Baroque churches where the images of saints seemed to whisper warnings about betrayals and revenge, echoing through the St. Francis of Assisi Church in Colonial Heights was silent on Thursday morning when Helen arrived. Carrying a digital camera and analysis equipment she had managed to borrow from the university under the pretext of completing a pending research project. Edward was waiting for her on the bluestone steps, wearing dark jeans and a white linen shirt that contrasted with the seriousness of his expression. "Did you manage to get out without any issues?" he asked, watching her struggle up the stairs due to the weight of her backpack. "I said I was going to spend the day at the NYU library researching restoration techniques," Helen replied, breathless. "Ryan believed me, but I noticed he checked my location at least 3 times before I got here." "How do you know that?" "He always taps his phone in a specific way when he's checking the tracking app. It's an almost unconscious movement, but after 2 years living with him, I've learned to recognize all the signs." Edward helped her with the backpack, noticing how her hands trembled, not only from physical effort, but from the constant nervousness that had become her permanent companion. "Helen, I need to tell you something I discovered last night." They entered the chapel attached to the hotel, where the light filtered through the colonial windows, creating an almost mystical atmosphere. Helen began to set up her equipment while Edward spoke. "I hired a private investigator to look into Mark Thompson. What he discovered is disturbing." "What exactly?" "Mark has a history of relationships with women who have significant inheritances. In the last 10 years, There have been at least 4 documented cases of women who lost their fortunes after getting involved with men who were, in fact, their employees. Helen stopped adjusting the camera and stared at him. Are you saying Ryan is an employee of Mark? More than that. Ryan works as a kind of human bait. He is hired to seduce vulnerable women, especially those who have recently received inheritances or are going through mourning processes. The revelation hit Helen like a punch to the stomach. She leaned against the chapel wall, feeling her legs go weak. So there was never any love. From day one, everything was calculated. I'm sorry, Helen, I know how painful this must be. She took a deep breath, allowing herself to feel the pain for a few seconds before channeling that energy into determination. No, I won't allow myself to be a victim. I'll use this to my advantage. What do you mean? If Ryan is an actor playing a role, then I can act too. I'll pretend I haven't discovered anything and gather evidence. Edward watched her examine the frescoes in the chapel with renewed determination. Helen, this is dangerous. If they suspect, they already suspect. The question is how much time I have before they decide to take extreme measures. She began to systematically photograph each section of the painted wall, her expertise in colonial art now serving a very different purpose than academic. Edward, you said Julia had found evidence against Mark. Yes, documents proving the embezzlement of money from the hotels. And she disappeared before she could use them. Exactly. Helen stopped in front of a fresco depicting St. Francis preaching to the birds, carefully studying the details. You know, during the colonial period, it was common for artists to hide messages in religious paintings, symbols that only the initiated could decipher. Where are you going with this? If Julia was as smart as you say, and if she knew she was in danger, it's possible she hid evidence somewhere that only someone with specific knowledge could find. Edward frowned. Do you think she hid something here in the chapel? It's a possibility. Think she knew your passion for history and architecture. She knew you would maintain this place and would eventually hire specialists to restore it. If she wanted to ensure that the evidence was found by the right person at the right time. Helen stepped away from the fresco and looked at the chapel with new eyes. No longer as an art historian, but as a detective searching for clues left by a desperate woman. Help me examine every inch of this chapel, she said. We're looking for anything that seems out of place, any detail that doesn't fit the typical iconographic pattern of the period. They spent the next 3 hours meticulously examining the walls, the ceiling, even the stone floor. Edward was beginning to lose hope when Helen softly exclaimed, Edward, come see this. She was kneeling near the altar, observing a small representation of Saint Rita that appeared to have been added later to the main set of frescoes. This image is different from the others, Helen explained, pointing out technical details. Look at the quality of the paint, the shading technique. It was clearly painted by a different hand, and much more recently. Recently means, I would say, in the last 5 years. Edward knelt beside her, studying the small figure of the saint. Julia always had a fondness for Saint Rita. She said she was the saint of impossible causes. Helen examined the base of the image with a magnifying glass she had brought in her equipment. Edward, there's something written here at the bottom. Very small letters, almost imperceptible. What does it say? For those who can see beyond appearances. The truth lies where the light does not reach. They exchanged glances, realizing they had found the first real clue, left by Julia, but deciphering its meaning would be just the beginning of a journey that would take them much deeper into the web of lies and dangers surrounding their lives. As the midday sun illuminated the chapel's stained glass, creating colorful patterns on the stone floor, Helen felt for the first time in months that she was in control of her own destiny. She was no longer just a victim fleeing from her tormentor, but a woman determined to uncover the whole truth, regardless of the consequences. The Blue House Inn was located on a narrow side street off Gold Street. A three-story colonial mansion painted light blue with white wooden windows that stood out among the neighboring buildings like a discreet jewel. Helen had discovered the place by chance while searching. Helen found a place to stay in Colonial Heights that wouldn't show up on the credit cards monitored by Ryan. The owner, a 72-year-old woman named Margaret Smith, had keen eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances and a sharp intuition for identifying women in delicate situations. "Are you running from someone, dear?" Mrs. Smith asked on the first afternoon, as she served chamomile tea in the small inner garden of the inn, where century-old rose bushes perfumed the air with their sweet fragrance. Helen nearly choked on her tea. "Why do you ask that? 40 years of hosting guests have taught me to recognize the signs. The way you look over your shoulder, how you always pay in cash, the way you avoid talking about your personal life." Mrs. Smith adjusted her reading glasses and studied Helen with maternal attention. "And there's also the fact that you requested a room in the back, away from Main Street." Helen sighed, realizing it was pointless to pretend with this woman. "It's a complicated situation. It always is. My own daughter went through something similar 20 years ago. Controlling husband, money disappearing, veiled threats." Mrs. Smith poured more tea, her movements deliberate and calm. "What do you intend to do about it?" "I'm trying to uncover the truth about some things. There are pieces of evidence I need to find." "What kind of evidence?" Helen hesitated, but something in the elderly woman's kind expression encouraged her to trust. A woman who disappeared 5 years ago may have hidden important documents somewhere in this town. She was married to the owner of the Heritage House of Tales. Mrs. Smith placed the teacup on the saucer with a sudden clatter. "Are you talking about Julia?" "Did you know her?" "Of course I knew her. Julia stayed here for almost a month before she left." Mrs. Smith looked around as if checking if anyone might be listening. She was terrified, poor thing. She talked about dangerous men, about stolen money, about evidence that could put a lot of important people in jail. Helen's heart raced. "Did she say where she hid that evidence?" "Not exactly. But I know she spent days in the attic of this house, rummaging through old trunks that belonged to the former owners. She said she was looking for the perfect place to hide something very important. Can I see that attic?" Mrs. Smith studied her for a long moment. "Are you related to her?" "Distant cousin, and I'm in the same situation she was." The elderly woman nodded gravely. "Then let's go upstairs." The attic of the inn was a maze of dark wooden beams and trunks covered with dusty sheets. Light filtered through small round windows, creating golden beams that danced among the dust particles suspended in the air. Mrs. Smith pointed to an area at the back of the room where several trunks were arranged in a semicircle. "Julia spent hours here," she explained. "She said she was studying the history of the house, but I realized she was looking for something specific." Helen began to examine the trunks systematically. Most contained old clothes, yellowed photographs, and documents from families that had inhabited the house over the decades. She was about to give up when she found, at the bottom of a dark oak trunk, a sealed envelope with the name Edward, written in delicate feminine handwriting. "I found something," she said, her hands trembling as she carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a small bronze key and a piece of paper with instructions written in code. Helen immediately recognized the pattern. It was the same type of cipher that art students used to decode iconographic symbols in ancient paintings. "What is this key for?" Mrs. Smith asked, peering over her shoulder. Helen studied the coded instructions, applying techniques she had learned over years of symbolic analysis. Gradually, the words revealed themselves. "Bank of America Downtown Branch, Safe Deposit Box 247. The truth about Mark and his accomplices. Use only if something happens to me. Trust Edward, Julia." "My God," Helen whispered. "She really left evidence. What will you do now?" Helen carefully tucked away the key and the paper. "I'm going to California to find out what's in that safe deposit box. But first, I need to warn Edward." When she found Edward in the lobby of the Heritage an hour later, he was on the phone with his lawyer, discussing the IRS investigation in a tense, controlled voice. "Things are getting complicated," he said after hanging up. "Mark managed to convince the investigators that I have undeclared offshore accounts. If we can't prove my innocence soon, I'll lose everything. Edward, I found something that could change everything." Helen showed him the key and the decoded paper. "Julia left evidence in a safe deposit box in California." Edward stood still for several seconds, studying the items as if they were sacred relics. "She was always smarter than all of us," he finally murmured. "Even knowing she was in danger, she found a way to protect the truth. We need to go to California tomorrow," Helen said. "But Edward, there's something else. I think Ryan suspects that I've discovered something. Last night he asked very specific questions about my schedule, about where exactly I'm researching. And this morning I found my apartment with small things out of place, as if someone had been looking for something." Edward watched her with growing concern. "Helen, maybe it's time for you not to go back to California. At least not to the apartment. I can't run away now. We're too close to the truth, and too close to danger." At that moment, Helen's phone buzzed with a message from Ryan. "Love, I'm worried. You're not answering my messages. Where exactly are you?" Helen showed the message to Edward, who frowned. "Reply that you're at the NYU library researching," he suggested. "But Helen, when we return to California tomorrow, I want you to come directly with me to the bank. Don't go home alone." As Helen typed the response, both knew they were entering the most dangerous phase of this entire investigation. The evidence they sought was within reach, but they were also being watched more closely than ever. That night, staying at the inn, Helena could hardly sleep at Mrs. Smith's through the window of her room. She watched the yellow lights of the colonial streets and thought of Julia, a woman who had faced the same fears, the same dangers, but who had the courage and intelligence to leave a path for the truth to be discovered. The dawn in Colonial Heights was silent when Helena finally fell asleep, dreaming of safes opening to reveal secrets capable of destroying lives and saving others. The First National Bank on 15th Street in New York City was an imposing building from the 1940s, with an Art Deco facade and an interior that exuded tradition and discretion. Helena and Edward arrived at 9 in the morning on a rainy Friday, both dressed formally to avoid drawing attention. Helena's hands trembled slightly as she presented the necessary documents to access Safe 247, but her voice remained steady and controlled. "Are you a relative of the previous holder?" asked the employee, a middle-aged man with thick glasses who carefully examined the request that Julia had left in the envelope. "Cousin," Helena replied, a technique she had learned during the months of lies with Ryan. "Julia gave me access in case of emergency." The employee checked the documents with the meticulousness typical of traditional banking institutions. But everything was in order. 15 minutes later, Helena and Edward were alone in a small, airy room, with Safe 247 open before them on a polished mahogany table. The contents exceeded all expectations. 3 meticulously organized folders, each labeled with names that made Edward gasp. Mark Thompson, Financial Diversions; Ryan Smith, Psychological Profile and Modus Operandi; Complete Scheme, Names and Connections. "My God," Edward whispered, flipping through the first folder. Julia documented everything. Bank statements, recordings of conversations, photographs of documents. Helena opened the folder with Ryan's name, feeling her stomach churn upon seeing her own photograph stapled to the first page, along with detailed information about her routine, her habits, even psychological analyses of her vulnerabilities after Aunt Carol's death. "Ideal target," she read aloud, her voice trembling. "Intelligent woman but socially isolated after recent mourning. Substantial inheritance without adequate legal protection. Personality prone to complacency and need for approval. Recommended strategy, gradual approach during emotional fragility." Edward gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "Helena, no," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "I need to read everything. I need to know exactly how I was manipulated. The folder revealed an elaborate scheme that had been operating for at least 10 years. Ryan was not just a con artist, but part of an organization led by Mark Thompson that identified wealthy and vulnerable women, studied their psychological profiles, and then sent specifically trained men to seduce them and drain their fortunes. "Look at this," Edward said, pointing to a spreadsheet in the third folder. "They have already stolen over $15 million from at least 12 different women. And here are the names of the offshore banks where the money is deposited." Helena systematically photographed each document with her cell phone. But when she reached the last pages of the folder on the complete scheme, she found something that made her stop breathing. A list of eliminated targets, where Aunt Carol's name appeared, with the date of death and the note, "Excessive resistance. Permanent solution implemented." "Edward," she said, her voice barely audible, "they killed my aunt." Edward read the document over her shoulder, his face paling. "And Julia found this out. That's why she ran." But Helena was no longer listening. Her mind was processing a terrifying revelation. If Ryan and Mark had killed Carol because she resisted their plans, what would they do to her now that she had discovered the whole truth? At that moment, her phone vibrated with a call from Ryan. Helena looked at Edward, who nodded gravely. "Answer, act normal." "Hi, love," she said, forcing lightness into her voice. "Helena, where are you?" "I woke up and you weren't home. I left early to take care of some things at the university. Pending documents from my teaching days." "What kind of documents?" Helena felt the trap in the question. Ryan had never shown interest in the bureaucratic aspects of her former career. "Issues with the employee health plan. Nothing important." "I see. What time will you be home?" "I don't know yet. Maybe just in the afternoon. That's fine." "I love you. I love you too." When she hung up, Helena was visibly trembling. "He knows," she said. "I don't know how, but he knows I found something out." Edward quickly put the documents into a folder he had brought. "We need to get out of here now and go straight to the police." "We can't trust the regular police," Helena said, remembering something she had read in the documents. "Mark has contacts in the judicial system. Look here. There's a list of judges and officers who take bribes to shelve investigations." Edward studied the list, recognizing some names. "Then we need to find someone we can completely trust. Someone outside the scheme." As they left the bank, Helena noticed a black car parked across the street with 2 men inside, watching the entrance of the building. As they began to walk, the car discreetly followed them. "Edward," she whispered, "we're being followed." He glanced discreetly over his shoulder and confirmed her suspicions. "Let's get on the subway. It's harder for them to follow us there." They quickly descended the stairs of Union Station, but Helena realized that the men had also gotten out of the car and were following them. In the midst of the morning rush-hour crowd, she felt a threatening presence approaching from behind. "Edward," she whispered, "I need to tell you something important. If something happens to me, nothing will happen. Listen. Last night, before leaving Colonial Heights, I sent copies of all the documents we found to 3 different people: my former advisor at NYU, an investigative journalist from the Times I met years ago, and my aunt's lawyer, who handled the inheritance. If I disappear, they have instructions to make." Everything was public. Edward looked at her with a mix of admiration and concern. "Helen, you've learned to think like them." "I had good teachers," she replied bitterly, thinking of Ryan and all the months of psychological manipulation that she now fully understood. When the train arrived, they managed to blend into the crowd and temporarily lose their pursuers. But they both knew that this was just the beginning. With the evidence now in their hands, the silent war that had been waged in the shadows was about to turn into an open and deadly confrontation. The train raced through the dark tunnels of New York City as Helen looked at her reflection in the window and saw no longer the vulnerable teacher she had been 6 months ago, but a woman transformed by the discovery of the truth and determined to fight for her freedom, regardless of the consequences. The apartment in Brooklyn was steeped in an artificial quiet when Helen arrived at 5 in the afternoon, carrying only a small bag and the overwhelming weight of everything she had discovered. Edward had insisted that she not return, but Helen knew that fleeing at that moment would only confirm Ryan's suspicions and put them both in greater danger. She needed to play the role of the innocent girlfriend for a few more hours until they could deliver the evidence to the right authorities. Ryan was in the kitchen preparing dinner, wearing the blue apron she had given him the previous Christmas, a carefully chosen gift from a woman who believed she was building a future with the man she loved. Now, watching him chop vegetables with precise movements, Helen felt nauseous, thinking about how many other women had lived this same domestic charade before her. "How was your day at the university?" he asked, without turning around, his voice carrying a studied casualness that could not completely mask the tension. "Productive. I managed to resolve the pending issues with the health plan." Helen set her bag down on the sofa, keeping her distance from the kitchen. "And you? How was your day at the office?" "Busy. Mark is organizing that investment we talked about, the one in Florida." Ryan finally turned around, and Helen noticed something different in his eyes, a coldness he no longer bothered to hide completely. "By the way, he wants to meet with us tomorrow to finalize the paperwork." "Tomorrow is Saturday. Important business doesn't respect weekends, love." Helen nodded, pretending to be normal while her mind raced feverishly. "Of course. Where will the meeting be?" "At his office in Alphaville, a more private place to discuss such high values." Alphaville. Helen remembered the documents she had seen at the bank. Mark's office in Alphaville was mentioned several times as the place where the victims signed the final transfers of their assets. It was also where two of the women on the list had been seen for the last time. "What time?" she asked, her voice remaining strangely steady. "At 10 in the morning. We'll leave early to avoid traffic." At that moment, Ryan's phone rang. He answered quickly, walking out to the balcony and closing the glass door behind him. Helen took the opportunity to discreetly check the kitchen drawers, looking for anything she could use as evidence or protection. In the third drawer, hidden behind a bunch of spare keys, she found a small dark glass vial without a label containing a white powder. Her blood ran cold as she recognized what it probably was, the same type of substance mentioned in Julia's documents as being used to neutralize resistant targets. Ryan returned from the balcony with an expression that mixed irritation and something Helen now identified as predatory anticipation. "Problems at work?" she asked innocently. "Nothing that can't be resolved tomorrow." He moved closer to her, placing his hands on her shoulders with a familiarity that now made her tremble inside. "Helen, there's something I need to tell you." "What?" "I know." The two words fell between them like a death sentence. Helen felt the world spin around her, but forced herself to maintain a confused expression. "Know what?" "I know about your trips to Colonial Heights. I know about Edward Smith. I know about the library, about the lies, about everything." Ryan's voice was now completely devoid of the false tenderness she had learned to recognize. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Helen instinctively recoiled, but Ryan held her wrists tightly enough to leave marks. "You've disappointed me greatly, Helen. After everything I've done for you, how I took care of you when you were lost and vulnerable." "Let me go, Ryan." "I can't do that. Not when you know things that could harm important people." He pulled her toward the sofa, forcing her to sit. "But there's still a solution. Tomorrow, you will sign the papers transferring the rest of the inheritance to the accounts Mark has prepared. After that, we'll take a romantic trip abroad, a fresh start." "And what if I refuse?" Ryan smiled, but there was no humor in his expression. "You won't refuse, because if you do, your new friend Edward will have a very unfortunate accident, and after losing two important people in such a short time, you'll become even more fragile and dependent on me." Helen understood that she was hearing her own death sentence being pronounced with the casualness of someone discussing the dinner menu. Ryan would never let her live after she signed the papers. She would be just another woman on the list of eliminated targets. "I need to go to the bathroom," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Sure, but leave your phone here." Helen handed over the phone, walked slowly to the bathroom, and locked the door. Her hands trembled so much that she could barely open the small window that led to the building's backyard. It was a drop of only 2 meters, but in her state, it felt like 2 kilometers. She heard Ryan knock on the door. "Helen, are you okay? In there? I'm feeling unwell," she replied, forcing sounds of nausea. "I think it was something I ate. I'll prepare some tea." Adaptações, Pousada de Dona Margarida, The Blue House Inn, Ouro Preto, Colonial Heights, Capella, Chapel, Dr. Miranda, Dr. Smith, Farmácia, Pharmacy, Rua Harmonia, Harmony, Street, Alphaville, Beverly Hills, Julia, Café, Coffee, Café Quente, Hot Coffee, Notícias, News, Polícia Federal, Federal Police, Organização, Organization, Franama, France, Evidências, Evidências capazes de destruir, evidence capable of destroying, café, coffee, 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 café de coffee, café, 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 coffee, café. De coffee, de café, de coffee, das café, das is de coffee, de café, das de coffee, das café, das de coffee, das de café, das coffee, das is café, das de coffee, café. Das Coffee, das ist Kaffee. Das Coffee, das Kaffee. Das Coffee, das ist Kaffee. Das Coffee, ist Kaffee. Was ist das Coffee? De Kaffee, der Tee ist ein Coffee. Le Café ist immer Coffee. Café ist immer Coffee. Le Café ist immer dort Coffee. O Café ist immer de Coffee. O Café ist immer des Coffee. Le Café ist und dann Coffee. O Café ist nur Coffee. Café ist nur Coffee. O Café ist immer de Coffee. O Café ist immer de Coffee. O Café ist Coffee, Café. Coffee, café de coffee, café, 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 coffee, café. De coffee, de café, de coffee, das café, das is de coffee, de café, das de coffee, das café, das de coffee, das de café, das coffee, das is café, das de coffee, café. Das Coffee, das ist Kaffee. Das Coffee, das Kaffee. Das Coffee, das ist Kaffee. Das Coffee, ist Kaffee. Was ist das Coffee? De Kaffee, der Tee ist ein Coffee. Le Café ist immer Coffee. Café ist immer Coffee. Le Café ist immer dort Coffee. O Café ist immer de Coffee. O Café ist immer des Coffee. Le Café ist und dann Coffee. O Café ist nur Coffee. Café ist nur Coffee. O Café ist immer de Coffee. O Café ist immer de Coffee. O Café ist Coffee, Café. Coffee, café de coffee, café, 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 coffee, café. De coffee, de café, de coffee, das café, das is de coffee, de café, das de coffee, das café, das de coffee, das de café, das coffee, das is café, das de coffee, café. Das Coffee, das ist Kaffee. Das Coffee, das Kaffee. Das Coffee, das ist Kaffee. Das Coffee, ist Kaffee. Was ist das Coffee? De Kaffee, der Tee ist ein Coffee. Le Café ist immer Coffee. Café ist immer Coffee. we café na dot to coffee, we café no to coffee, we café na dish coffee, the café shoe and then coffee, we café no coffee, café no to coffee, we café shumus no the coffee, we café no the coffee, we café shoe coffee, cafe, coffee, cafe, de coffee, cafe, 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 coffee, cafe. The coffee, the coffee, das Kaffee, das ist the coffee, the Kaffee, das die Coffee, das Kaffee, was, das the Coffee, das die Kaffee, das Coffee, das ist Kaffee, das die Coffee, Kaffee. Das Coffee, das ist Kaffee. Das Coffee, das Kaffee. Das Coffee, das ist Kaffee. Das Coffee ist Kaffee. Was ist das Coffee? The Kaffee, the tea is in coffee. The Kaffee is in coffee. Kaffee is in coffee. The Kaffee is in dot to coffee. The Kaffee is in to coffee. The Kaffee is in dish coffee. The Kaffee shoe and then coffee. The Kaffee is no coffee. Kaffee is no to coffee. The Kaffee shumus no the coffee. The Kaffee is no the coffee. The Kaffee shoe coffee, cafe, coffee, cafe, de coffee, cafe, 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 coffee, cafe. The coffee, the Kaffee, das Kaffee, das ist the coffee, the Kaffee, das die Coffee, das Kaffee, was, das the Coffee, das die Kaffee, das Coffee, das ist Kaffee, das die Coffee, Kaffee, das Coffee, das ist Kaffee, das Coffee, das Kaffee, das Coffee, das ist Kaffee, das Coffee, ist Kaffee, was ist das Coffee? The Kaffee, the tea is in coffee, the Kaffee is in coffee, Kaffee is in coffee, the Kaffee is in dot to coffee, the Kaffee is in to coffee, the Kaffee is in dish coffee, the Kaffee shoe and then coffee, the Kaffee is no coffee, Kaffee is no to coffee, the Kaffee shumus no the coffee, the Kaffee is no the coffee, the Kaffee shoe coffee, cafe, coffee, cafe, de coffee, cafe, 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 coffee, cafe. Coffee, cafe, 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 coffee. 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 Cafe. The healing process was long and sometimes painful. Helen needed to relearn how to trust her own instincts, to distinguish between genuine care and subtle manipulation, to value her independence without fearing loneliness. Edward stayed in Colonial Heights throughout this period, not as a protector or savior, but as a friend who gradually became something more. They spent hours discussing art, history, the traumas they had both faced, and the dreams they still wanted to pursue. "You know you don't have to save me," Helen said one June afternoon as they watched the sunset from the restored chapel's balcony. "I've already saved myself." "I know," Edward replied. "That's why I'm in love with you." The inauguration ceremony of the restored chapel took place on a clear September morning, attended by local officials, art historians, and even some journalists interested in the true story behind the restoration. Helen presented her complete analysis of the iconography, explaining how each symbol told the story not only of colonial faith, but of the resistance of women who faced adversities throughout the centuries. Mrs. Smith, who had become a maternal figure in her life, cut the inaugural ribbon with a proud smile. "This chapel represents much more than art," she said to those present. "It represents the strength of women who refuse to accept destinies imposed by others." That night, Helen and Edward dined alone on the balcony of the Heritage House, watching the golden lights illuminating the historic churches of the city. The future stretched before them like a blank book, filled with possibilities that she finally felt free to choose. "Do you regret anything?" Edward asked. Helen thought carefully about the question, gazing at the stars shining over the mountains of Virginia. "I regret taking so long to trust myself, but I don't regret the path that brought me here." When the church bells rang at midnight, announcing a new day, Helen knew she had finally found something she had unknowingly sought for years. Not only the love of a good man, but self-love, and the confidence that she was capable of building a life that was genuinely her own. The full moon illuminated the cobblestone streets of Colonial Heights as a woman who had learned to distinguish between appearances and reality walked toward the future she had chosen for herself. Finally free from the invisible chains that had bound her for so long,